This is lecture one, part two, and in the last part of this lecture, we had just gotten through talking about an ethical mandate for social workers to promote social justice, which in turn begs the question of what exactly is social justice, this term that we use so often and so freely. And so to help us better understand this notion of social justice, I look at a textbook written by Amanda Baruch. She's a social worker, a social work professor, where in her book she discusses various philosophical traditions that attempt to define social justice. We're going to look at an oligarchist perspective, we'll look at libertarian perspective, we'll look at two different liberal perspectives on social justice. But before we get there, I think we should acknowledge that there's really so many different ways of conceptualizing around this idea of social justice. For me, the simplest way to think about social justice is to think of it in one of two ways. There's an aggregate type of social justice where the issue is about allocation of resources, where you're concerned about a just or equitable allocation of resources. And then there's the more person-to-person level, the interpersonal relations level of social justice, where you're thinking about human rights and such. This whole discussion really pertains to allocative justice or distributive justice. And so if you can keep that in mind as we move through this material, I think it'll help you better understand some of these different philosophical traditions and what they have to say around this notion of social justice. So first, we have an oligarchist view of social justice. And so to an oligarchist, inequality is, or unequal distribution of resources is perfectly acceptable. Unequal distribution of resources is typically determined by the fact that some people are born into a higher class, while others are born into a lower class, maybe to a poverty-stricken family, for example. And so that sort of standing is in turn, it was historically thought that that sort of standing was determined by God, that there was divine ordination. So it's sort of a passive view of social justice where our standing in life is determined by God, or where we were born into in life, in other words. We don't really lay much importance on this line of thinking too much nowadays in social policy circles, but there are modern forms of oligarchist type thinking. Namely, if you look at some of the arguments that were put forth by Charles Murray in his book, The Bell Curve, where he essentially argues that allocation of resources is determined essentially by one's genetic predisposition. So it could be that one person, by virtue of their higher IQ, has access to greater resources. The next person doesn't because of their lower IQ, or maybe it's because of race. These are arguments that are put forth by Charles Murray in his book. You can check out the book, The Bell Curve, if you want to get into more detail into those arguments. But the big picture idea is that we don't really lay much importance on traditional notions of oligarchist thinking. But I discussed this precisely because we still have some remnants of oligarchist type thinking, namely in the idea that genetic predisposition determines our lot or our standing in life, or distribution of resources in life. The next line of thinking is with respect to libertarian views of social justice. And for me, when I think about libertarian conceptions of social justice, the first thing that pops out for me is the word liberty in the term libertarian. So naturally, there's an emphasis on liberty over an equal distribution of resources. Inequality to libertarian is the price that we pay for the freedoms that we enjoy. And so for libertarian, distribution of resources is often determined by how much you produce. So if you have someone like Donald Trump or say Bill Gates, who's contributed much to this economy, then the resources that have accrued to that person or that individual are justly so, because that person has produced more than the next person over. So it's distribution according to product is the basic rule there. Libertarians, because of their emphasis on liberty, typically oppose government intervention. So we're talking about liberty in the form of freedom from government intervention. So things like taxation to a high degree, or affirmative action. These are attempts to redress past wrongs. These are things that libertarians typically oppose. I'm sort of taking an extreme position here, but these are the general points that libertarians espouse. There's Robert Nozick, who says that this is one form of libertarian thinking, but he says that unequal distribution or inequality that results is acceptable so long as the process by which that inequality comes about was fair. The idea is that we need to look at the opportunity structure. So if everyone is entitled to the same opportunities in terms of education and employment, and we end up with a certain degree or a great deal of inequality, that inequality is perfectly acceptable according to the Nozick view, since the process was in fact fair. So this is a process-oriented view of social justice. That's Robert Nozick. We then move to liberal notions of social justice. We have two different branches of thinking here. We have the contractual approach that was promoted by John Rawls, and then we have the utilitarian approach that was promoted by John Stuart Mill. So first we look at the Rawlsian approach, and of course these are all very simplified arguments here. If you want more detailed discussion about these philosophical traditions, I would recommend that you check out John Rawls' book, A Theory of Justice. Not easy reading, so this is all philosophy, so maybe 500 pages of text, but this is essentially his argument. He says, put yourself in a hypothetical world where you don't know your standing in life. He calls this the veil of ignorance. If you were behind this veil of ignorance, what sort of distribution rules, distribution in terms of allocation of resources, what sort of distribution rules would you promote in that society? And so he rationally argues that that in that type of society, in that hypothetical world, that one would choose distribution rules that favor the least well-off, because you don't know where you stand in that society. You don't know if you have more resources than the person next to you. You don't know if you're smarter, if you're stronger, if you have more human capital than the person next to you. So, because you might be among the worst off in that society, you're going to choose distribution rules that provide some sort of safety net, or the language that he uses is a social minimum. You want some sort of social minimum in place in that society. We want a social minimum according to the Rawlsian view, but there is a catch here. If you set that social minimum too high, you end up sacrificing productivity or economic efficiency. In other words, there's less incentive to work hard if there's that social minimum in place. And so that's the basic Rawlsian view. The operative words there are putting yourself behind a veil of ignorance, making sure that there's a social minimum in our society, setting that social minimum as high as possible without sacrificing economic efficiency. Those are the main points behind the contractual approach. And then finally, you have the utilitarian approach behind social justice. So once again, we're just very quickly glossing over these arguments, but if you want more detail, you can check out John Stuart Mill, his book on the connection between justice and utility. But there's the basic premise in his book that there's a natural or intuitive sense of justice, that we would all recognize justice or injustice for that matter if we saw it. So if there's a 6'6", 300-pound guy pounding or beating up on some other guy who's maybe 5'5", 110, that we would recognize, that we would all recognize to some extent the absolute injustice that we see. The basic distribution rule that we would want in terms of utilitarian thinking is that which promotes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So we think about the greatest good, we think about people's happiness. Everyone's happiness or utility, in his language, is valued equally. One person's utility isn't weighted more heavily than another's. And so, for example, if you're given 3 different policy options, you would pick that policy option that favors the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that maximizes utility, in other words. So those are the basic operative rules in terms of the utilitarian approach to defining social justice. So I leave you with a very simple question. Well, maybe not too simple, but I leave you with a question of where do you stand when you think about these different approaches to explaining social justice? Do you see yourself as an oligarchist? Do you see yourself in the liberal or libertarian camp? Or do you see yourself in one of these liberal strands of social justice? I'd like you to think about that as we move on to the next section. So there will be a case study in your midterm exam that asks you to apply these basic concepts in the context of a case study. So please keep that in mind as we move to the next section.